Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be doing another opinion video, but I want to do more videos like this where I'm kind of talking about what I think makes good transit. And so today I'm going to be talking about why I think service frequency is one of the most critical elements to transit. And to be fair, this is something that gets said a lot already, but it's something that I think isn't really put into action. We see systems all over the place with really poor frequencies and where something like a 30-minute frequency is considered frequent. So let me go and explain to you why service frequency is so critical. So the first thing I want to point out is something that I think often distracts people. And that's that bigger vehicles, bigger trains, articulated buses, double-deckers, it all seems really cool. Why wouldn't you want a giant 12 or 10 car train with massive stations, large platforms? It seems awesome, right? Same with articulated buses. They're big, they have lots of space. Isn't that a good thing? The problem is, I think people are often focused too much on individual capacity on a single vehicle. And what that leads to is to basically meet the demand on any particular route, you run a lower frequency because more people can fit on each vehicle and hence your frequency doesn't need to be as high. Now, what I want you to focus on is the rail system of Vancouver, the SkyTrain. Now, I could talk about the fact that the Expo line runs 4-car trains, though to be fair, those 4-car trains are only 70 meters long. But what I really want to focus on in Vancouver are the Canada and Millennium lines. Both the Canada and Millennium lines, at least currently, typically run 2-car trains, and the Canada line is essentially designed for 2-car only operation. Now, to be fair, the Canada line uses significantly wider trains than are used on the Expo and Millennium lines. By the way, the Millennium line is designed for up to 5-car trains, but because, again, service frequency is what's so critical, TransLink actually chooses to run 2-car trains on the Millennium line because instead of having 4-car trains but running less frequently, they've determined that running 2-car trains but at a higher frequency is a better approach. Now, to be fair, this is a kind of enviable decision that TransLink gets to make because when you think about it, for TransLink, the combination of train cars or separation of them basically doesn't change the cost because all you're really paying for TransLink is the electricity that is used to run the trains. This doesn't exist in all systems because in many systems where you actually have operators, of course the SkyTrain in Vancouver is fully automated, then you do have to consider the fact that if you have individual trains, well, now you have to pay 2 operators instead of just 1. Doesn't apply to the SkyTrain, but perhaps that's a benefit of automated transit. Nonetheless, the thing that shocks many people who aren't from Vancouver when they first visit Vancouver, when they try the SkyTrain, is the service frequency. It's unbelievably high. Even when you travel to major cities like New York, London, and Paris, you'd be surprised that often on many of their metro and rapid transit lines, the frequencies aren't as high as on Vancouver SkyTrain. It's not unusual on the Canada line to see frequencies under 3 minutes. And on the Expo and Millennium line, something you'll notice if you ride at the front seat of the train, which of course I recommend because you can, is that you'll often come into stations directly following another train where the distance between you and the train before could be as low as about 90 seconds. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, I think what's important to note is that while the trains are so small and the capacities are so high on the SkyTrain system, that still leads to relatively high capacities. I'd like to point out that there are numerous heavy rail subway systems in the United States. Let's look at the LA Metro heavy subway system, for example, which carry less people than Vancouver SkyTrain, despite using massively long trains that are multiples longer than what Vancouver uses. And that's all because of service frequency. While these systems can operate at around a 10-minute service frequency sometimes in the peak, Vancouver consistently operates at 2 or 3-minute service frequencies. And what's better is that even in the off-peak, you notice that in Vancouver, it's still not unusual to see 3 or 4-minute service frequencies, which again leads to such high capacities. Now, unfortunately, Vancouver's service frequency model doesn't really extend to its buses, or at least not to the extent I think it really should. But in that case, we have another fantastic example, Toronto. Now, something that I found incredible in Toronto was just the frequency of buses. Even when you're in suburban Toronto, North York, Scarborough, buses can come as close together as every 5 or 10 minutes. This is really impressive, and it's far beyond what other cities in North America and even other places in the world often do. What's more, in Toronto, there's a so-called 10-minute network. While other cities often have 15 or 30-minute frequency networks, Toronto's is every 10 minutes, and it's often better than that. Now, I should also point out there's a benefit here in that people don't have to look at a timetable at the stops. In fact, many Toronto bus stops don't even include timetables at all because people don't need to think about them because the next bus is always within sight. And that's kind of a line people like to use, always within sight. Anyways, and another important thing to note is that in Toronto, there's not this huge fall off in service frequency. Of course, in the peak, there's express routes running, etc., larger vehicles. But even in the off-peak, there's still really high service frequency, which is great because it means that you don't just get limited to using the transit service in the peak hours. It's really easy to use it at any time of the day, which is absolutely fantastic. And that service even is pretty frequent at nighttime. In Toronto, it's crazy to say, but Toronto's night network is competitive with many all-day networks in other cities in North America, and that's just a testament to the service frequency that has been pushed. And Toronto sees fantastic results from that service frequency. Toronto has a number of the most used bus routes in North America, as was mentioned in a previous interview I did, if you want to go take a look at that. The point being made is that that high frequency of service really drives ridership, and it's convenient for riders. So now that I've kind of given you some examples of what I'm talking about, I want to really drill down into why I think this is so critical. The first thing, connection window. Now, you might not know exactly what I'm talking about, so let me explain. Where I live in Metro Vancouver, South Surrey, transit is not all that frequent. And while this wouldn't be a huge problem in Toronto, for example, if I want to go to, say, downtown Vancouver, I have to take 2 buses and then a train. It doesn't sound horrible, but here is the huge problem. See, the first bus I have to take is every 30 minutes, and the second bus can run anywhere between every 15 and every 30. Why is that a problem? Well, you see, if you're trying to make a connection between 2 services, if they have a really low frequency, which I think 30 minutes can be considered, in fact, I think most things over 15 minutes should be considered a low service frequency, well, then what happens is that every time you have to make a connection, you have to factor in the fact that you could be waiting up to that maximum length. Now, again, you don't have to necessarily consider that because on average, you'd imagine you're usually going to get there roughly 50% of the way there to the next vehicle. But still, on a network where every bus is coming every 30 minutes, that means that on average, every connection you make, you're going to have to add 15 minutes to your trip waiting for that next bus, which means that after only 1 or 2 transfers, well, you've eaten a ton of time already waiting for buses, and that means that trips that you can make realistically in a certain set period of time are really reduced because every time you make a transfer, it just adds a ton of time to your overall trip. In Toronto, this isn't as huge of an issue, and what I like to liken it to is how people usually use rapid transit systems. You don't see people worried when they're on a subway system or a metro about, oh, now I have to switch lines, it's going to take so much longer because now I'm switching lines and I have to wait for the next vehicle. That's because metro systems run at such high frequencies. Well, what was amazing to me living in Toronto was that the bus system operates in largely the same way. You can go to the intersection of any major streets where there's a really frequent bus route, and then you can just transfer quite easily, knowing that the next bus is, on average, not going to be more than around 10 minutes away. This means you can take trips with 2 or 3 transfers and still have them be reasonable trips where transfer time is often only around 20 minutes as part of the entire trip. And when your trip is about an hour, for example, 20 minutes of transfer time is not that bad. And it's far better than the 40 minutes you might be spending on other networks. And so that transfer window makes transit so much more functional, particularly in bus networks. The next point is one I think people really don't think about, and I think it's actually surprisingly important. So let me paint you a picture. When I was a kid, I didn't ride transit. My family tends to like to drive, unfortunately, and I grew up in the suburbs. However, there was some bus services. I remember being at my grandparents' house once and someone basically knocked on the door and said, do you know where the local bus stop is, or is there a bus I can use to get to downtown Vancouver? And I remember my aunt saying something along the lines of, oh yeah, but it only comes X amount of times per hour. And I was just shocked. I was like, really? There's buses that even come out this far? And that's what I mean by street presence. often when buses run as infrequently as every hour or even half hourly, you don't even see the buses when they come because they're coming so infrequently. And what I think that actually leads to is people don't even realize they're being served by a transit system. Often too, when those services are so infrequent, the stops are minimal, it's maybe a curb and likely just another pole which blends in with the numerous utility poles and signs that you see all over cities around the world. And so what that again leads to is people don't even know that they're being served by transit. When you have buses that are operating on a frequency like the TTC, you can't help but notice, because if you're walking down the street, you'll see a number of buses passing you. Again, remember, if buses are operating on a roughly 5-minute frequency and they're going in both directions, plus you have some express services, that means that even less than every 2 minutes, you're going to be seeing a bus go by. And what that does is it reinforces to people the idea that, the buses are there. The bus is an option for me. Especially when they see a lot of buses going by, well, wow, there's a bus so often, I should really think about taking it. And so I actually think that service frequency leads to this street presence that's actually really valuable, especially in areas where transit may not be something that people are considering taking. So now I want to kind of hit back on that main point of capacity. And what I'm going to do is use an example that is quite hyperbolic, but I think really illustrates the point well. Look at the GO Transit Lakeshore line. It's a regional rail line in Toronto that connects a ton of really important municipalities to the core of Toronto. So you'd think that line's going to carry a ton of people. And you know what? It does. For a regional rail line in North America, it carries a lot of people. The Lakeshore line as a whole carries around 90,000 people per day. Pretty impressive, right? In fact, trains on the Lakeshore line often operate as frequently as every 15 minutes. Again, fantastic for a regional rail line, especially to consider that these are diesel trains, not even electrified. And that service frequency, while being good, also is backed up capacity-wise by massive trains. In fact, on the GO Transit network, it's not at all uncommon to see 12-car long trains. These are 300-meter plus long trains, so that's a third of a kilometer of train, which are double-deckers. They can fit around 3,000 people on every single train. Now I want to point out another system, Vancouver's Canada Line. As I mentioned before in the video, the Canada Line operates just 2-car trains. So you must be thinking, well, there's no way that system could compete with the incredible capacity of those 12-car double-decker trains on the Lakeshore line in Toronto, right? Surely it couldn't happen. The context sure is different, but assuming that these services are being utilized pretty well, let's just take a look at how the Canada Line with its 2-car trains compares with the 12-car trains on the Lakeshore line. Well, as I mentioned, the Lakeshore line sees about 90,000 riders every day. The Canada Line, almost 140,000. And the Canada Line is actually being upgraded so that it can carry even more people. At its maximum capacity, it should be able to carry around 300,000 people per day, if not more, given that more people use the service off-peak. And that's the power of service frequency. You see, while I mentioned that GO Transit route often operates at frequencies up to every 15 minutes, it just cannot compete with a service operating often at the lowest every 3 minutes. And why is that? Well, because when you consider that high service frequency, that means that for every 12-car GO train we have, we have 5 2-car Canada Line trains. Now, again, that's still only 10 Canada Line cars, but again, since this is a metro line, there is definitely a factor to which people are kind of crowded in more because it's a metro line and a lot more people stand, etc. But I think my overall point here is just that you don't need massive trains to have good capacity. Operating at high service is a great way of achieving capacity, and in fact, it's the best way of achieving high capacity in my personal opinion. And why? Because it naturally encourages you to move towards that high service frequency model, which has all these other benefits as I've mentioned. And the great thing is, once you're operating frequently, then you can add more train cars. It's not impossible to do. And when you have strong demand like the Canada Line in Vancouver has, for example, then it's easily justifiable to spend a lot of money to expand the stations and add longer trains because, you're carrying a ton of people already. And so I think that is why frequent transit is so important and why service frequency is one of the most critical things about transit that people need to know. I should leave this off with a few studies I wanted to mention. If you go look up transit frequency studies, there's a number of them. they pretty much all point to the same thing I've discussed in the video. But of course, I like to try to tie this in because I don't have any professional transit credentials, and so surely you should go look at some of the studies, etc., to see what I'm talking about. In fact, one study I saw on Twitter recently showed that light rail ridership can basically be broken down into 3 factors, and one of those 3 factors that basically determines the ridership of any light rail system, service frequency. So obviously, service frequency is totally critical. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned to the channel. If you're not already, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Have a good night.